I wanted to just talk about relationships, just relationships in general, how we form relationships, and why I think it can really be a struggle for people to find good relationships in their life, how we maintain relationships, right? Things like that. That's what I wanted to talk about in this video. And so, first of all, I want to discuss the three types of relationships that we have, right? We have family relationships, romantic relationships, and obviously just friendships, right? And obviously, I don't need to explain what those are. We all know what those are. And so I wanted to discuss, first of all, family relationships, because I think family relationships are very interesting, right? Oftentimes, and I'm talking particularly for those who grew up with, not even immigrant parents, right? But people who grew up, actually, no, I'm talking in all honesty about people who grew up with immigrant parents. And one thing I find really interesting is that if you go on TikTok, you'll find people talking about how they would cut off or how they cut off their immigrant parents because their immigrant parents were abusive or they were emotionally absent or whatever it may be. And they cut them off in the future and they just end up just leaving them alone, right? They don't have any ties with them. They don't talk to them. And I always personally think that that's a tragedy when I hear about it. But regardless, these people with these immigrant parents sometimes that are abusive, or just in general, people who have parents that are abusive, or maybe siblings, whatever it may be, people who cut off their family members. And I find it interesting that if you go to those videos, you'll see comment sections that are typically quite divided when it comes to specifically cutting off family members, especially immediate family members. So, like your mother, your father, your siblings, right? You will see comment sections that are very divided, right? Typically torn between, obviously, hey, that's your mother. Hey, that's your father. Hey, that's your brother. Hey, that's your sister, right? You shouldn't abandon them. You have an obligation to them, right? They're your blood. As opposed to the other side of it, which is like, hey, they mistreated you. It doesn't matter. You have a right to cut them off. You have a right to sort of abandon them. And I always find that interesting. We hold familial relationships to a different standard than friendships and romantic relationships, right? We have a much, I guess, broader range of tolerance when it comes to treatment for those types of relationships. And I think it's quite simple why we hold familiar relationships to a different standard. It's because they are fundamentally different, right? Your family, right? The people that you grow up with, or the people who raised you, the people who you have an inherent connection to. And obviously, we all as human beings have an inherent connection to each other, but the connection that you have with a family member is different. Obviously, you have a blood direct connection to another person. And in this world, right, which has billions of people in it, having a direct blood connection to someone is really meaningful. And so we hold those relationships to a different standard, right? We're more willing to tolerate abuse in those relationships. We're more willing to tolerate mistreatment in those types of relationships. And so I just find it interesting how we hold familial relationships to a different standard. Now, it makes sense why we do, right? That fundamental blood connection sort of makes us inseparable. That's why we shudder, we turn away from the idea of cutting someone off, right? Of cutting off your mother, cutting off your father. We turn away in disgust at that idea, especially in immigrant cultures, right? People who come from Africa, people who come from Asia. Family is everything, right? And so we turn away, right? We shudder in fear at that idea of cutting off our parents, right? In particular, our parents. And I just find it interesting, right? We hold those relationships to a different standard, and it's obvious why, right? But it doesn't necessarily mean we should be willing to tolerate abusive dynamics, right? We shouldn't be willing to tolerate abuse or mistreatment simply because they're our mother or father, or just because whatever it may be. I think an important thing about relationships and maintaining them in general is just in a basic sense treating each other well. It's sort of a common sense thing, but sometimes we forget it, right? Treating each other well. And so I do find that very interesting when it comes to familial relationships. I do think, right, whenever possible, people should try and mend relationships with whether their mother, father, brother, sister. I think one of the saddest things that I hear personally is hearing people who cut off their parents or cut off their siblings. It's really sad. And I'm not saying people don't have a right to do that or you're not ever justified. All I'm saying is that it's a shame. Family that is broken, right? That is not together, that is not unified, is just a sad sight to see, right? Because you have a family thinking that you guys are going to stay unified, that you guys are going to be together. And so seeing a family break up, I think, is a true tragedy. It's really something sad because you go out of your way to make a family. You go out of your way to make a family because you think you'll be happy, you think you guys will stay together. And yet, the family can break apart. So that is something I find really sad when it comes to familiar relationships. I think one thing when it comes to romantic relationships that I find really interesting, how they deteriorate. One thing that will always surprise me is seeing people go from being in love, right? People who get married. I'm talking about married couples, right? Because I'm talking about couples in general, but I'm talking particularly about married couples. Married couples and divorce. That is something that's really interesting to me, right? Obviously, when you get married, right, you think this woman or this man, whatever the situation may be, you think that this is the one, right? Everyone who's getting married, obviously, generally speaking, thinks that the partner that they find is the one, right? That is the one that I'm going to spend the rest of my life with. That is the one I'm going to start a family with. That is the one I'm going to have a house with, whatever, you know? Everyone thinks that they found the one. And yet you will find that, and obviously this doesn't happen in all marriages, but you will find that after maybe 5, 10, 15 years, that the marriage has just turned loveless. That the person, who you married, who you were in love with previously, is nothing more than just a roommate. You guys don't have that spark anymore. You guys don't have that intimacy. You guys don't even feel like a married couple anymore. Especially too when these married couples have children, there isn't really any spark left and they're just together because of the children. I wonder what is it about romantic relationships that that can cause them to deteriorate in such a dramatic fashion. So obviously, right, the relationships that we have, all relationships we have can deteriorate and can break down, right? But I think with romantic relationships, it can be so dramatic. People who go from being absolutely in love with each other, madly in love, willing to devote themselves to each other, right? In body and soul, right? At the altar or whatever it may be. And then 10 to 15 years later, they're fighting, they're screaming at each other, they hate each other, they can't stand each other. What could possibly happen to cause a relationship to deteriorate like that? And why does that happen in so many marriages? Why do so many marriages just turn loveless? They turn loveless. They just turn into a simple business agreement, or if you're having children, yeah, we're just doing it to raise the kids. We don't really love each other anymore. It's sad. It's extremely sad to see. And I just wonder, why does that happen in romantic relationships? Why can they deteriorate in such a dramatic fashion? Because when I think about the relationship between parents or between siblings, right? Those can fall apart or those can be weakened or whatever. Or friendships, right, that we have with other people that we meet. Those relationships can become more distant, right? We can become further apart, not as close. And obviously those relationships can deteriorate as well or break down in dramatic fashion if something happens. But I feel like it's much more common for marriages. Why do people, or really how do people go from being absolutely in love with each other to divorcing and hating each other? What is it about romantic relationships that causes that, right? Because when I think about the close relationships that I have now, right, I think that could never happen to us, and it never would. But for some reason, with romantic relationships, we can see that dramatic change, that dramatic shift. And I think that idea, right, of loveless marriages being sort of completely devoted to a person and there being nothing left really of the marriage, nothing that really makes it a marriage anymore, right? is really what turns people and scares people away from getting married, right? And obviously, divorce obviously has ramifications, not just in the emotional sense, but also in the financial sense, right? And so that's something that's important to consider as well. When it comes to friendships, I think when it comes to the friends that we have, I think a lot of that just comes down to luck, right? I think we can make an effort to put ourselves out there. We can make an effort to try and talk to people. But at the end of the day, relationships are a two-way street, right? And people need to reciprocate. I think something sad is that when you become an adult, it becomes much harder to make friends because everyone really is focused on their own thing. And people sort of have their friends at that point. People sort of have stuff is sort of already established at that age. And so to try and make true intimate friends at that age is much harder. I think the thing we don't realize is that when we're in school or college, we don't really have to make that much of a conscious effort to make friends. We're in an environment where interaction is encouraged. We're encouraged to talk to people. We're put in situations constantly where we have to talk to people. And so we don't realize when we're in high school or when we're in college how easy we have it from a social perspective, right? People are like, I'm not going to date in high school. I'm not going to date in college. Maybe you should, because you might not have the opportunity outside of it. You're never going to be in an environment with so many people, people of your age, people pursuing a similar goal. Interaction is encouraged, right? Maybe you see a pretty girl on the street, you go up to her, she's going to think you're trying to take her, you're trying to kidnap her, right? And I don't blame her at all. That's the way society is. But bottom line, what I'm saying is that when you're in college and you're in high school, social interaction is encouraged. It's a part of what you do, it's a part of your daily routine, right? And so we don't realize how blessed we are, right? When we're in high school and when we're in college, to have the opportunity to interact with other people. It becomes much harder when you become an adult, obviously, when you're out in the real world, because you don't really have that one unifying thing that is bringing everyone together socially. You don't have high school, right? You don't have college, everyone getting a degree. You don't have that shared space where everyone is in the same place going after that same goal, whether it be a degree or a diploma. And so it becomes much harder in the real world. You're now an adult working, and you're just working, coming back home, working, coming back home, working, coming back home. Weekend comes around. Okay, I don't have to go to work. Now what do I do? Where do I go? And so it's important as an adult to find those spaces that are reminiscent, not necessarily reminiscent of high school or college, but these it's important to find these spaces where you can interact with other people that are your age, right? Where interaction is encouraged. These spaces where people are there volunteering their time just to try and talk to people and to make friends. These spaces are extremely important, right? There's so many adults who feel lonely, and we really take it for granted again when we're in high school and when we're in college. But there's so many adults that feel lonely, that are miserable, that don't have any friends. They're just working and coming back home. They're not really living for anything. And so, what is needed really for these people above all is a space where they can be comfortable and a space where they have other people to talk to, right? That sort of goes away when we become adults, and that is a part of what can make adulthood so isolating and lonely. When it comes to maintaining relationships, right? So let's say, you have good friends, etc. I think relationships it obviously becomes much harder to maintain friendships once you get out of high school. It becomes even harder once you get out of college, right? High school makes it extremely easy. You're there 5 days a week. You're seeing these faces every day. You guys probably hang out on the weekends, maybe not. You don't even need to because you guys are seeing each other 5 days a week, right? It's extremely easy to maintain a relationship in high school. It's not hard, right? Now, once you go out of high school, you go to college. So maybe some of your friends from high school go to the same college as you, maybe not, right? How do you maintain the relationship with those friends that you had? that go to different colleges, what do? You check in on them. You text them. You call them. You say, hey, what's up? One thing we don't do sometimes, or one thing we don't realize, is just that those basic things we have to do to maintain a relationship. And it's not just relationships with friends, it's relationships with family members too, and even with your partner. Obviously, with a partner, obviously communication is much more it's sort of more obvious. Like, I need to talk to my girl, I need to talk to my boyfriend, whatever. But sometimes we neglect that when it comes to our familial and our friendships. Just simply sending a text and saying, hey, what's up? Specifically for men, right? Just sending a text message and saying, hey, what's up? People don't want to be the first person to reach out, then no one reaches out. You guys go years without communicating with each other. And you guys were great friends in maybe high school or college. You guys go years without communication because no one bothers reaching out. That's how relationships deteriorate. And you think it can't happen to you. It can happen to anything, to anyone, to any type of relationship. If you don't put in the effort to maintain a relationship, it will deteriorate. You have to check in on each other. That doesn't mean calling each other every day, sending messages to each other every day, texting back and forth. It doesn't have to be anything too crazy. It can be simple. But as long as there's some sort of communication, people should not be going months, especially in this day and age, without communication with their friends and their family members. It just shouldn't be happening. Everyone has a phone. Everyone has iMessages or messages on Samsung. You guys have ways to communicate with each other. So maintain relationships by communicating to some extent with your friends and making sure that they're okay. And hopefully, if they're good friends, they'll reciprocate. If not, then you know that these aren't really your close friends or your true friends, right? They're basic things that are done to maintain relationships, right? Relationships are a two-way street. They require input from both parties. If only one party's working, relationship won't work. Relationship will deteriorate. You will know very quickly after high school who your friends are. After college, you will know who your friends are very quickly. It's very interesting how quickly it changes from high school to college. You go from talking to a bunch of people to talking to a narrow subset of those people. Now, obviously, you go to college, so you have a bunch of people to talk to, but it's just interesting how you realize very quickly a lot of those people that you talked to in high school were actually not as close. You weren't as close to those people as you thought you were. And that's not to say that you weren't friends with those people, but you weren't really that close to them in reality. Because the moment that a little bit of effort was required in order for communication to occur between you and that other person, it doesn't happen. You see, it's very easy to fall into that mindset when we're in high school or when we're in college, thinking that we have more friends that we actually think. It's easy to fall into that mindset of thinking that we have more friends than we actually do, right? Because it's so convenient to interact with people in high school. We're all in the same place. We're there again 5 days a week from 8 to 3. So it's so easy to think you have a lot of friends. Then high school ends and you realize who your real friends are. The people who will put in the effort to communicate with you. The people who will go out of their way to communicate with you. Who won't just communicate with you when it's convenient, but who will go out of their way, even when it's inconvenient, to communicate with you. Who will set up things. Those are your real friends. You'll realize very quickly after high school who your real friends are and who your real friends aren't. So that's all I have to say regarding relationships. I know this video was a little bit of a ramble. I know I stuttered at times, but hey, try my best. Let me know if you want to see more. Have a great night.